The year is 1220, and the smoke rising from the burning heart of Central Asia is thick enough to blot out the sun, casting a permanent twilight over the Silk Road. You are a seasoned Mongol general, standing on the precipice of history, watching the greatest city in the Islamic world, Bukhara, crumble into ash and ruin. You have spent your entire life in the saddle, riding across the endless frozen steppes, witnessing the horrors of tribal warfare, where blood feuds lasted for centuries and men were slaughtered over stolen horses. You thought you had seen every variation of cruelty that the human mind could devise, and you believed that your heart had hardened into stone. But today, standing amidst the smoldering remains of civilization, watching your leader, Genghis Khan, issue orders with the cold precision of a mathematician, you feel a sensation you thought you had left behind in childhood. It is a deep, creeping horror, not at the violence itself, for violence is the language of your world, but at the terrifying system that orchestrates it. What you are witnessing is not the chaotic looting of barbarians, but the implementation of a legal framework that transforms human beings into raw industrial materials. This is the story of how the greatest empire in human history was built on a foundation of meticulously organized human trafficking, and how the boy, who once wore the wooden collar of a slave, rose to become the architect of a system of dehumanization so effective that it haunts the geopolitical landscape to this day. Stay with us as we descend into the darkness of the 13th century to understand how the progressive lawgiver and the ruthless monster were the same man. To truly comprehend the psychology behind this industrial machine of misery, we must wind the clock back 50 years to the 1170s, to the desolate, windswept plains of northern Mongolia. We find a teenager named Temujin existing in a state of absolute abjection. He is not a conqueror. He is a piece of property. For weeks he has been trapped in a kang, a heavy wooden board clamped around his neck designed to restrain livestock. It is a device of psychological and physical torture that prevents him from lying down comfortably, feeding himself, or even scratching the lice that crawl across his face. He is kept in a cage, treated as a trophy by the Temujin clan, who captured him to prove that the bloodline of his father was broken forever. Every day he is dragged out to be mocked by the clan's children, and every night he is chained in a different tent under the watchful eyes of different guards. He is slowly starving, his body wasting away, but his mind is sharpening like a blade on a whetstone. While other prisoners would be consumed by despair or fantasizing about a violent, impossible revenge, Temujin is studying the social dynamics of his captors. He observes that power breeds complacency. He notices that during the seasonal festivals, when the fermented mare's milk flows freely, the guards become sloppy, and the chains of command loosen. He waits with the patience of a wolf watching a herd.
On the night of the Onan River Festival, when the camp is drunk and distracted, he makes his move, swinging his heavy wooden yoke to knock out his guard and fleeing into the darkness. He hides in the river, submerged up to his nose in freezing water, while his captors hunt for him. This escape was his first masterclass in the utilization of human weakness, but it was merely the culmination of a childhood defined by betrayal. Years prior to his enslavement, when Temujin was only 9 years old, his world was shattered by a violation of the most sacred law of the steppe. His father Yasugai, a powerful chieftain, was poisoned by Tartar rivals while sharing a meal, a treacherous act that turned hospitality into murder. In the vacuum of power that followed the death of his father, Temujin learned the most brutal lesson of his life. The Temujin clan, who had sworn loyalty to his father and feasted at his table, looked at Temujin's mother Hoylan and her 7 small children and saw only liabilities. In a harsh environment where caloric intake meant the difference between life and death, they decided that supporting a widow and orphans was an economic burden they refused to bear. They packed up their yurts, gathered their herds, and rode away, leaving the family to die on the winter steppe. Temujin stood shivering in the snow, watching the backs of the men who were supposed to be his uncles and cousins as they condemned him to death by exposure. This abandonment was the crucible that burned away any childish notions of loyalty, honor, or tradition. Hoylan kept them alive by teaching them to dig for wild onions and garlic, to hunt marmots, and to fish in the frozen rivers, but the psychological scar was permanent. Temujin realized that social bonds were fragile fictions that evaporated the moment survival was at stake. He understood that in this world there was no justice, there was only power. If you wanted to survive, You could not rely on the kindness of others. You had to possess the strength to force the world to bend to your will. By the year 1206, the boy who had been hunted like an animal had turned the tables on the entire world. Through a combination of brilliant military tactics, ruthless pragmatism, and sheer force of personality, Temujin had conquered or absorbed every major tribe on the Mongolian plateau. He called a massive assembly, known as a Kurultai, by the headwaters of the Onan River. There, amidst the fluttering of the nine-tailed white banner, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the oceanic or universal ruler. But Genghis Khan was not interested in merely being a warlord. He wanted to build a nation that would endure forever. To do this, he introduced a revolutionary legal code known as the Great Yassa. When historians analyze the Yassa today, they are often struck by how surprisingly modern and progressive many of its tenets appear.
In a radical break from tradition, Genghis outlawed the kidnapping of women, a scourge that had fueled intertribal warfare for generations. He declared that all children born to a Mongol man were legitimate, regardless of whether the mother was a wife or a concubine, ensuring that no child would face the stigma of illegitimacy. He established a policy of religious tolerance, allowing Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamanists to practice their faiths freely within his camp, recognizing that religious persecution was a waste of resources and a source of unnecessary instability. Perhaps most significantly, he forbade the enslavement of any Mongol. He made it a capital offense for one Mongol to own another, and made it a legal duty for any Mongol to liberate a countryman found in chains. However, it is here, in the fine print of this enlightened legal code, that the true horror of the Mongol Empire begins to take shape. The Yasa was not a humanitarian document. It was a nationalist manifesto. It drew a stark protective circle around the Mongol people, creating a privileged class of citizens whose rights were sacrosanct. But for everyone outside that circle, for the millions of people in China, Persia, Russia, and Central Asia, the law offered no protection whatsoever. In fact, the same law that prohibited Mongol slavery implicitly legalized and institutionalized the slavery of everyone else. Genghis Khan did not abolish the institution of slavery, he simply weaponized it. He reorganized his entire society into a military machine based on the decimal system. The old tribal identities were erased, and men were assigned to units of 10, called an arban, then units of 100, called a zun, then 1,000, called a minghan, and finally 10,000, called a tuman. This structure destroyed the clan loyalty that had once led to his abandonment and replaced it with an absolute, terrifying loyalty to the state. It was a system of collective responsibility, where if one soldier fled the battle, the other 9 in his arban would be executed. If the whole arban fled, the zun would be punished. It was a surveillance state built on fear, where every man watched his neighbor because his own life depended on his neighbor's obedience. The first cracks in the moral justification of this system appeared early during the forest campaigns in Siberia. Genghis had appointed a general named Kuchi to govern the Oirad tribes of the northern forests. Kuchi was a capable administrator who ensured the flow of tribute furs and falcons back to the capital. But he had a dark vice. He began using his imperial authority to abduct the daughters of the tribal chiefs for his personal harem. This was a direct violation of the spirit of the Yasa, which forbade kidnapping and bride theft. When the forest tribes finally reached their breaking point, they rebelled, laying a trap for Kuchi and killing him. When news of this reached Genghis Khan, his reaction revealed the true nature of his law. He did not punish Kuchi's memory for violating the law. He did not offer restitution to the tribes whose daughters had been stolen. Instead, he sent his eldest son, Jochi, with a massive army to crush the rebellion and subjugate the tribes completely. Kuchi's crime was not that he was a predator, but that he was incompetent enough to get caught and cause a disruption in the empire's supply chain. This incident proved that in the eyes of the Khan, non-Mongols were not citizens with rights. They were livestock to be managed, and if they bit the hand of the shepherd, they would be slaughtered. This dehumanizing philosophy reached its terrifying industrial apex at the siege of Bukhara in 1220. Bukhara was not just a city, it was a symbol. It was the cupola of Islam, a metropolis of high culture, renowned for its libraries, its poets, and its unbreakable walls. The Khwarezmian governor of the city looked at his massive fortifications and his garrison of 20,000 soldiers and believed he could withstand the Mongol storm. He was wrong. The Mongol army did not just attack, they engineered the battlefield. They diverted the river that fed the city's moat, turning the defensive water feature into a muddy trench that could be easily filled. They cut off all supply lines and surrounded the city in a ring of silence. When the outer defenses were breached, the Turkish garrison panicked and tried to break out, only to be cut down to the last man. The citadel held out for 12 days, but resistance was futile. When the city finally capitulated, Genghis Khan rode through the gates and straight into the history books as a figure of apocalyptic terror. He entered the Grand Mosque, the holiest site in the city, and rode his horse into the courtyard. He ordered the massive chests containing the sacred Qurans to be emptied and used as troughs for his horses to feed. As the city's elite, the scholars, the imams, the wealthy merchants gathered before him, trembling in fear, he ascended the pulpit and delivered a speech that was equal parts theology and psychological warfare. He told them, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." By framing his conquest as divine judgment, he stripped the people of their moral will to resist. But the speech was merely the preamble to the processing. What happened next was not a chaotic massacre, but a systematic sorting of human capital. The Mongol soldiers ordered the entire population of Bukhara to evacuate the city and gather on the open plains outside the walls. There, under the watchful eyes of the Mongol cavalry, the citizens were divided into categories, like cattle being sorted for market. This was the heart of the Mongol war machine, a bureaucracy of slavery. The first group separated from the crowd were the artisans. The Mongols had a deep appreciation for craftsmanship, and they maintained detailed intelligence on the skills of the cities they conquered. Weavers who could make gold brocade, blacksmiths who could forge superior steel, engineers who could build siege engines, and scribes who could speak multiple languages were pulled from the crowd. These individuals were too valuable to kill. They were enslaved and shipped thousands of miles east to the Mongol homeland, where they would build the Khan's new capital, Karakorum.
They became a privileged class of slaves, fed and housed, but forever the property of the state. The second group consisted of the young, able-bodied men who had no specialized skills. In any other conquest, these men might have been slaughtered to prevent a future rebellion, but the Mongols had a more sinister use for them. They were conscripted into the hashar, the levy. These men were forced to march ahead of the Mongol army as it advanced to the next city. They were the ones who were whipped forward to dig trenches under enemy fire. They were the ones forced to push the heavy battering rams up to the gates. And in the most horrific twist of all, they were used as human shields. When the Mongols attacked the next city on their path, they would force the hashar of Bukhara to storm the walls first. The defenders of the next city would look down and see their own countrymen, their fellow Muslims, charging toward them. They would be forced to shoot arrows into the bodies of their neighbors to get to the Mongols. This psychological torture broke the spirit of the defenders, often causing cities to surrender before the battle even began. The life expectancy of a man in the hashar was measured in weeks. The third group was comprised of women and children. These were treated as movable chattel, distributed among the Mongol soldiers as part of their pay. The young women were taken as concubines or servants, while the children were often adopted into Mongol families or raised to serve the empire, effectively erasing their cultural identity. The final group was the elderly, the sick, and the infirm. In the cold economic calculus of Genghis Khan, these people were useless mouths. They consumed resources but produced nothing. They were executed methodically and efficiently, and their bodies were left to rot as a warning to the next city. This sorting process was not a one-time event. It was the standard operating procedure for the Mongol conquests. From Samarkand to Nishapur, from Herat to Baghdad, the same scene played out over and over again. The Mongols developed a massive administrative state just to manage the logistics of this human trafficking. They had scribes whose only job was to track the movement of skilled slaves across the empire. A goldsmith captured in Russia might find himself working next to a potter from China in a workshop in Mongolia. It was a globalized economy built entirely on the back of forced displacement.
He demonstrated that the rule of law can be used to justify the greatest crimes imaginable if you simply define the victims as being outside the protection of the law. As we look back at the smoking ruins of Bukhara from the vantage point of history, we must recognize that the generals who stood there in 1220 were witnessing the birth of a dark modernity. They were watching the moment when war stopped being a contest of warriors and became an administrative process of resource extraction, where the resource was humanity itself. The boy who sat in the wooden kang on the frozen steppe learned his lesson well. He learned that to avoid being the slave, you must become the master, and that the only way to ensure you are never dehumanized again is to build a world where you hold the keys to the chains. This is the dark legacy of the Mongol Empire, a legacy that reminds us that the most terrifying evils are not committed in fits of rage, but are planned in committee meetings, written into law books, and executed with the stroke of a pen. The Yasa promised equality, but delivered a hierarchy of suffering that changed the genetic and cultural map of the world forever. It is a history written in blood, but organized in ink. If you found this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of the Mongol Empire valuable, please subscribe to the channel as we continue to expose the raw and unfiltered reality of our shared past. We do not shy away from the darkness here, because it is only by staring into the abyss that we can understand the forces that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next discovery.
The terrifying brilliance of this system was that it weaponized fear to such a degree that it eventually made violence unnecessary. As the stories of the sorting at Bukhara spread along the Silk Road, terror traveled faster than the Mongol horses. Merchants and refugees carried tales of the cold efficiency of the Khan. City after city realized that resistance meant annihilation and the sorting of their people. So they began to surrender proactively. Rulers would send emissaries to Genghis Khan, offering their submission and voluntarily sending thousands of their own people as slaves to the Mongols in exchange for being spared the destruction of their city. The system of organized slavery became a diplomatic tool, allowing the Mongols to conquer vast swaths of territory without shedding a drop of their own blood. The threat of the system was as powerful as the system itself. This infrastructure of exploitation created an unprecedented transfer of wealth. Mongol generals who had grown up in felt tents wearing rough wool were suddenly the owners of thousands of human beings draped in Persian silk and eating off Chinese porcelain. The empire became an addiction, fueled by the constant influx of new human capital. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the system he built was self-sustaining. His sons and grandsons continued the practice for centuries. Kublai Khan incorporated these slave hierarchies into the legal structure of the Yuan dynasty in China. The Golden Horde in Russia demanded an annual tribute of slaves from the Russian princes, keeping the markets of the Mediterranean stocked with human flesh for hundreds of years. The enduring legacy of Genghis Khan is often debated by historians. In Mongolia, he is the father of the nation, the genius who brought law and order to the chaos of the steppe. And this is true. Under the Yassa, the Mongols enjoyed a golden age of peace, stability, and prosperity. Crimes like theft and murder were almost non-existent within the empire. A lone traveler with a gold plate on his head could theoretically walk from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea without being molested. But this Pax Mongolica was a peace purchased with the currency of systematic dehumanization. It was a peace that existed only for those inside the circle of the Yassa. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of power and civilization. We often like to think of history as a struggle between the civilized and the barbaric, between the lawful and the lawless. But Genghis Khan challenges that binary. He was not a barbarian in the sense of being chaotic or stupid. He was supremely rational. He was a lawgiver. He believed in order. The horror of his empire was not that it lacked a system, but that the system was perfectly designed to exploit human beings. He showed the world that it is possible to be a progressive reformer for your own people, while being a tyrannical monster to everyone else.